In this video here, I'm going to take you through all the tips and tricks I use to create display bases. You don't have to be perfect blending or perfect techniques to bring your ideas to life. This is just an expression of your creativity. These are some of my favourite ones: a goblin on a tree stump, which is the first one I ever did, an Imperial Fist Space Marine, very basic, a Cities of Sigmar Steel Rook, and finally an Old World Waystalker. There are many more on my Instagram, but these ones are my favourites. The inspiration of this piece sits down and comes from Lutherian99 on Instagram, who's created the Amberfall project, a beautifully grimdark mix of Stormcast Eternals and Witch Hunters. So, the link is in the description below. Please go check him out and share some love. When it comes to bases, we need to set out a plan in advance. A lot of people sketch, but I can't sketch, so I just model it in blue tack. Bases are made up of three elements. We have the main element. This is your underlying stuff. This is going to be your rock. We then have the texture. This is where we tie together these sort of... Finally, we have the finishing on top. This is where we add all sorts of tufts and general small bits of finishing. Originally, I wanted my Steelhelm to feel like he's standing in a city, like he's defending the last line. With half of the stones down, I put the mini on and take a look. I feel like there's some promise here, but the front needs to be explored more and the back is also far too open. So, I want to try and build it out a bit. I've come to at this point here the realisation that it's not really looking how I want it to in my mind. The floor is too uneven and the distances between the height of the stones just feels unnatural. It's not in scale. So we're going to go back to the drawing board and try and redo this in a different method. During this early concepting phase, take pictures of all of the ones you do. You might come back to it and say I really liked this about it and you don't want to lose that. So photograph it before you disassemble it. At this point here, I've now flattened it all out, made the cobblestones into a better sort of line, and come to something I really like about this. There's sort of like a bit of flow to this mini, where if we start in the top right, we have the axe or the hammer, which is drawing attention. We then come down into the middle, and we've got the face, and then we come down a bit more into the bottom left. So we've sort of got this sweep of where we want to draw the attention, so I want to try and make sure my main focuses are going to stay in these areas. However, I still don't feel like the concept's working for me here, so we're going to come back and remodel a final concept. So I'm going to now move him out, sort of put him like he's coming into the entrance of the city. We'll still have these hints of cobblestone, but it allows us to add more elements. We feel like a fence is going to fit naturally. We can also add rocks and all this sort of stuff. All of this additional texture is really going to help us. So, with the concept ironed out, we now move on to the process of sculpting it out of milliput. Don't forget to take your pictures for reference. I get the general shape of the base down first. I'm just mashing milliput on there and smoothing it out with a wet finger. I don't worry about going over the edge of the display plinth. I'm going to be sanding it back afterwards to get that nice smooth effect. I keep placing the mini on just to check the positions of where I want it, to check that there's enough sweep here for it, and I think I've got something. So I now move on to my cobblestones. I use the same process as last time, only I'm using smaller balls of milliput. Trust me on this, if you get them to the size you think they're going to be, chop them in half again and they're actually at the size you want. I then press them down and start sort of shaping them out to make them square. It doesn't have to be accurate, it wants to be very rough. We're still going for that hand feel, that worn feel. I'm positioning these stones in such a way that it's sort of creating a line through the base. A line that he's standing on, this small path which is sort of dilapidated and fallen apart. I'm not trying to put stones everywhere because I'm going to come in and put additional rocks in there to make it feel more natural. So it sort of looks a bit like a broken cobblestone path. With the rocks in place, I can now move on to positioning the fence. I'm using coffee stirrers here, pick them up from Starbucks or whatever. I'd keep chopping them up, scrape up the edges and make them look a bit rough. You can come in with pliers or tweezers as well to put a bit more texture on the end of it, but I'm really looking for something here that feels in scale. I push them down to the milliput and then I push the milliput around it to make sure it's got a firm bond. No real need for super glue here, don't worry about it. I know I want a Stormcast head in this somewhere, but I don't know where yet. So I'm sort of just playing around looking for where I can put it, where feels like it's going to work. I got the position here wrong. I should have put it more towards the bottom left, so I've got that thing that draws the attention. and kind of got to hope the shield does a lot of the heavy lifting here. With the Stormcast's helm in place, I now sort of start positioning rocks around the place and try to create these little islands of interest across the base. Don't worry about leaving exposed milliput, we want to leave some. This is what we're going to put our texture pastes on later. I spend a bit of time just smoothing everything up with a wet finger, putting the mini on and checking that I'm happy with all the final positions, squaring up a few stones here and there to remove some of the rounded edges, which are maybe a bit too round, before it's time to wait for it to dry. After 24 hours, the model is fully cured, so we can start to sand it back. For this here, because I'm using one of Taro's plimps, these are polyurethane resin, we need to make sure we are wet sanding. We want to reduce as much dust as possible. Wear respirators or anything you feel safe as well, but you really don't want to breathe this stuff in. Make sure you hoover it up afterwards as well. In the first pass, we sort of want to sand it back that we can see a clear, distinct line around the outside between the base and the milliput. Once this is done, we can then sort of move in and start to refine it and polish it down with higher and higher grit. After sanding, we can now move on to the second step of the base. At this stage here, we're sort of adding the additional textures we want on there. For me, I'm using Soilworks by Scale 75, and I'm just covering it all over the place, trying to leave exposed milliput and exposed rocks in area, especially the cobblestones and the helmet, so that you can still see them through there. A good tip with texture pastes like this is to put them on thick and then come on later with a brush overloaded with water and smooth it out a bit. Else you get what feels to be really unnatural sort of undulations in the dirt. This is probably why a lot of the texture pastes you put down sometimes sort of all just feels the same, because you're still building it up really high. We fit our mini one final time to check we're happy with the placement and commit to our final alignment. I'm not gluing the mini to the base at this stage here. I'm just putting a pin in the base in the position where I know he's going to be, because I want to paint the mini separately where I have full access to get all around him. We then prime everything in black, and we need to take special care with the base here. We're going to be doing a couple of layers of prime here. We need to make sure that when we put our coats down, we can't see a transition between the black polyurethane resin and the green milliput. For me, this was about 3 layers of Monument Hobbies airbrush primer, but there's no reason you can't do this with a rattle can. So let's get started. Everything here is base coated with burnt umber. Because I'm trying to mimic the effects that Litharian's got, only I'm not using oil paints, we need to sit down and discover what makes something grimdark. For me, this is sort of adding dirt and rust and mud everywhere, but makes it feel like it's sort of living in that environment and has been there for a long time. So this means my highlights are going to be very sort of like tight and controlled in small areas, and my shadows are more going to be filled with oranges and dark browns. For the non-metallic metal, I do this the same across the whole mini wherever it is. I'm going to show you on a shoulder pad here. I start with a mix of art black, vanilla white, and a tiny bit of dark Prussian blue. This is just to give a sort of a blue tinge to it. You really don't need much here. If it's reading as a dark blue, it's reading wrong. I then position the highlights on there. I'm sort of covering most of it, trying to leave some of the shadows just to get the burnt umber showing through. I then start the process of highlighting this up using a non-metallic metal style. So I do a wide band and I get smaller and smaller and smaller as the brightness value goes up and up and up and up, giving us a nice peak where we're going to get the specular highlight from the light source itself. Remember to pay special attention to the edges, and just the top of the edges are going to be brighter than the bottom, because the top is reflecting from the light, the bottom is reflecting from the ground. To get these colours, I just sort of start mixing in more and more white into my original mix, sometimes mixing in a bit of vanilla white just when I feel like it's got a bit too desaturated. This is the main process here. It's sort of mixing these colours and seeing what feels right to you. If you focus on the highlight placement, you'll be in a good place. As we go up and up in value, don't forget to add a little bit of chips and cracks here and there. We can do this by just putting small dots and doing very light brush strokes to imitate battle damage. When it's all highlighted up, we now need to wash it back down. For this, I'm using the burnt umber again, and I'm just making sure the brush is overloaded with water. I'm trying to cover it and focus towards the recesses building up a couple of layers here. I'm not really creating a glaze as such, it's much closer to a recessed shade. Spread this out, however, a bit further than you think is necessary, because we need to sit down and make sure some of this brown appears across the whole surface to make it feel like it's dark, it's sort of battle damaged, there's mud everywhere. I do the same process here with the chainmail, only I'm sort of not doing each individual link, I'm taking the whole thing as holistically. I'm mostly overbrushing it, getting narrower and narrower with how much pressure I'm applying to the brush to make it seem like the highlights are positioned correctly. In actual fact, if you were to zoom in and look at this, it wouldn't look anything like metal, but because we're looking at it far enough away, we're in a good place. After we've highlighted it up, remember to wash it back again. Now for the cloth, we need this to read as very sort of brown, but also very light and very white and kind of vibrant. When we look at our original reference pieces from Litharian, his white is striking. So for this, I start with a mix of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. This gives me a nice base coat. However, I wanted to make this a bit lighter again, so I mixed in a bit more vanilla white. The advantage of these heavy body acrylics is they don't do full coverage very well on your first coat. Because you water them down a lot, it's quite hard to do it. This means I can take solid advantage of what we learned in the Deathwing tutorial, link above, where we can use overlapping layers to build up our highlights and our positions with only using one colour, especially because we're going over black. As we keep highlighting this up, a sort of mix between mixing in vanilla white and pure art white, but I'm more leaning towards the art white on this time here. This is because with the reference piece, again, it is white. So, at some point here, I get to a stage where I'm just continuing to mix it up enough that I've got to pure white. And I'm using this very sparingly on only the tips and the tops to really draw attention to it. I come back every so often again and wash it down with the burnt umber again, just to put a bit more of the grime into the feel of the white. When I feel like it's looking too clean, I come back in with the overloaded brush and wash it back. I don't really use the pure white on the bottom of him. I sort of reserve this for the front of his chest, as this is where the light's going to be hitting most. This is the most vibrant part and the prominent part. I want to draw attention to it. The right tabard he's got on the side here really shouldn't have been highlighted up much at all, because it's going to be hidden behind a shield. With the black cloth, I highlight this up a lot using burnt sienna and yellow ochre again. Again, these colours are really going to come up a lot. I start with mixing in just the black and the burnt sienna, I lighten it up with the yellow ochre, and finally with vanilla white. The trick I do here though is, at this stage here, it's going to look a bit too similar to the white and everything, because it's using the same colours, there's no sort of difference and distinguish to it. I want this area to feel distinct however, so I'm going to use a much heavier wash than I have before. I'm going to mix this almost as in it's like a 1:2. So it's really doing quite a lot of coverage. And then all of that previous extreme highlighting we did where we went all the way up to pure vanilla white is completely knocked back and brought into line with the burnt sienna wash over the top. This sort of glaze really tones down the high values and brings it more in line and makes it more muted. I don't want this to really be a main area you look at. It's sort of a supporting element that just needs to feel like it's a different colour, but I don't want to use the different colours for it. The less colours I have in my palette, the more I'm going to be mixing and trying to get different tonal varieties between them. The yellow for this I really quite like actually. I quite like how muted it came out. I start by making sure it's all sort of covered properly with the burnt umber. Any of the white might have overspilled onto it, so I want to clean that up. I then go straight in with a couple of layers of thinned yellow ochre. We're really taking advantage of the fact that we can thin these paints down to get them to look very transparent. I build this up in a couple of places, focusing towards the tips of, I think it's a sun? I don't actually know. And after that, I start to mix in more intense yellow. This is just focused towards the edges, and of course, I'm going to then wash it back again with the burnt umber to make sure that brown is really in the deep recesses of this part. I didn't film it, but on the shield I did the same process for the yellow, only I also added black into the mix, so I got a darker areas to there, focusing them towards the edges and the very deepest recess. The leather was painted again Can you guess? Burnt sienna and yellow ochre. This mix is really doing a lot of heavy lifting here. When we play around with the quantities of each, we can get quite a lot of variety in there. And if we sit down and focus on the textures we're applying with a brush, so with leather, we're focusing on the edges, adding scratches, microchips and everything all over the place to make it feel like more distressed leather. This time here though, I don't touch the white. I'm only mixing in vanilla white for this because I still want this leather to retain some level of warmth. I do a couple of different layers of highlights, mixing in more and more vanilla white. I think at the end I ended up using just pure vanilla white on some of the edges and everything, and using it very sparingly though, because we've got such a high contrast value between the highs and the darks here. It really needs to be done sparing, else it ends up looking too much like metal. With this here, I'm washing it back with black this time here. Maybe a bit of burnt umber mixed into it, but not much at all. The red here is really used sparingly as just some sort of way to draw attention to it. I mix burnt umber and primary red together to get a very sort of dark browny red. I do a couple of layers of this. I then come straight in with pure primary red and just build up a couple of layers as well. I painted the whole sword here red and I really didn't like how it came out. I should have distinguished some of the elements better, so I then come back in afterwards and repaint my non-metallic metal recipe all over the elements which should have been metal in the first place. Again, you guessed it, some of this is then washed back with the burnt umber wash again. Now, when it comes to skin tone, I don't really know how to mix them at all, so I have to resort to model colours for this. I pick up a sort of middling Caucasian skin tone and a very light Caucasian skin tone. That's the sort of feel I'm going for this. I take burnt sienna and mix it into the middling skin tone. I really love this colour, burnt sienna. It really makes the whole thing sort of tie and gel together. I mix it in about a 1:1 ratio and cover all the skin. I then go straight in with my middling skin tone, making sure everything's sort of thinned down nicely so that I can do it over a couple of layers to build it up and really position the highlights where I want them to be. I'm paying special attention here to the top of the brow, the top parts of the cheekbones as well, and if he had one, a chin, but that's covered in a beard. I don't know about you, but the inside of my mouth is not the same as my skin tone, so I need to mix a bit of red into my base colour I've got here and cover the inside of his mouth with it. I'm not really trying to draw too much attention to this, but I need it to be distinct and different. I don't want to go for a traditional sort of just cover it black, because if we mix in a bit of red, we can also get the lips done at the same time. You could then come in with an off-white and pick out some of the teeth. I didn't do that. I then go straight into my next colour up, which is my sort of lighter Caucasian skin tone. And again, I'm drawing focus into these areas. There was a great video that came out recently by Eric Swinson on, I'm going to take something I learned there of mixing in sort of a glaze to sort of give a 5 o'clock shadow. And in this case here, I'm using it on top of his head to make it look like his hair has only recently been shaved off. Now, for the beard, I'm using the same recipe I did for his chest, only I'm playing with the textures here and drawing lines, focusing in the direction that the beard will be growing and just building it up and building it up, mixing in more and more of my lightening colours. This time here though, I go a lot more in the white. I really want his beard to look white, like he's an old sort of haggard warrior. While I used white sparingly in the cloth, in this time here I'm sparing no expense. I'm keeping it thin and I'm going all over it. I don't want to do full coverage white however, else we just lose the feel of it. It doesn't feel like it's white, it doesn't feel like it's natural. It feels like someone's just spray painted something white at the end and that's his hair. Kind of like it's been hair dyed, I guess? I fancied a bit of a break from a mini at this stage here, so I decided it was time to paint the base. I cover everything in a mix of burnt sienna and black and make sure I get full coverage across everything, including all the wood and all the stone. After the coverage is applied, I start to pick out the stone. For the stone here, I've just taken black, a bit of vanilla white and a bit of pure white and just sort of started mixing them together to get sort of a middling grey. There's no real distinct recipe I've used for this, but I don't want to go too light because I plan to take the highlights up quite high before washing them back again. When painting stone, it's important to realise there's no sort of like distinct areas of this area here is fully this colour, this area is fully that colour. Stone is a very rough and uneven texture, so for this I want to make sure the brush is sort of doing small scratching lines, stippling, not doing full coverage, and just build up the highlight placement in an area I think feels right. Because we're going to be putting the mini on this, I haven't actually paid much attention to where the mini is going to be standing, so everything is highlighted up the same. But those sort of things can be changed and adapted later. I didn't do it. With the stone painted, we now sort of finish off the mud. For this, I'm going to be mixing in yellow ochre. Again, I'm playing with the ratios here to get it to a point where it feels like it's sort of drying mud, and then overbrushing across the whole of the texture, not really worrying if it gets on the stone a bit. I'm trying to avoid it as much as possible, but I'm not too concerned about it because it's just going to look like dried and caked on mud. I don't mix in any vanilla white when I'm doing this. I do pure white on this because I want it to feel a bit desaturated. The stones I then decide to paint the same as the mouth. I take the same mix I did for the mouth, just burnt umber and primary red, and cover it fully. Again, not really too worrying about slight overspill. I then mix it up, highlighting it with yellow ochre, just tie it in a bit homogeneously, but I also mix in a bit of vanilla white into this. This way it sort of feels lighter, it feels different. It's meant to be stony, it's not meant to be muddy. The wood is then painted. I start with the same colour I did for the rocks. I just overbrush all over it, and I then start to mix in quite aggressively vanilla white and then finally white, just to build up the highlights and build the lines. I'm making sure the brush sort of moves in the same direction here across the path. Wood grain goes in one direction, so I try and keep the brush moving in one direction. I then come in afterwards and pick out some areas with burnt sienna, again washing it back. But I also decide I feel like there needs to be a bit more variety in the base, so I do the same thing I've been doing with the burnt umber, only I'm using a green grey this time here. I'm mixing it together, making it very watery, and pick out some of the areas on the base to just add a tiny bit of subtle difference between it. It's not much, but it's enough that I've noticed it and it feels better to me for it. Now time to attach the mini to the base. Because we've got the pin in the bottom of the base, I clean that off a bit with a sharp knife and then drill out the hole on his foot again, just to remove any super glue in there, dob some super glue on and commit and stick him down. I press him down into the angle I want, making sure the holes on his feet and the pin on the base are lining up, and that's the model stuck. We now get onto the third and final part of the base, the interestingness, where we're sort of doing the landscaping and putting all the shrubbery and all of the debris on top. This is stuff that would sit on top of the texture, so fallen leaves. Honestly, every single one of the companies which make these tufts make them too big, especially for this scale. So chop them in half, chop them in quarters, and you get them down into a much better variety. It also makes them last a lot longer, and you feel like you can put them in different places without overloading the base. Around fence posts, it's really hard to chop stuff, so that feels like it's going to be overgrown more than in other areas. Once I've sort of positioned everything where I want it to be, I can move on to what is probably my favourite part of this base, which is the leaves. For these, I've got some autumn style leaves. I position these all over the base with just small dobs of super glue here and there. I'm doing where it feels right. Great thing to try and do here is to try and get stuff underneath the mini. So you could have glued the mini on at this stage here after you've put all of it in, or you can sit down and try and position bits of shrubbery and cloth under the feet. This is a great tip I use, where I just sort of, if the base hasn't quite lined up perfect and there's gaps under there, if I put a shrub under there or if I put a leaf under his foot, it makes it look like he belongs more in the environment. I then paint the hammer and the shield the same as I've painted in other areas. The final part of the build to me is always my favourite bit. It's where I get to pull the masking tape off and finally reveal everything I've created exactly how I intended it to. I love what I've managed to create here in such a short amount of time. I'm not really using any advanced techniques. My glazing has been incredibly rough, and I've mainly just focused on layering and putting stuff where I want it to be. Display basing doesn't have to be super fancy. You don't have to use all the advanced techniques, and hopefully this has inspired you and opened up some of the techniques you can do to create these pieces, to create these scenes. I have a City of Sigmar Steelhelm standing outside on the road to a city, raising his hammer up high to defend it from those who would invade. It's not the most creative story, but it's my story I've told here.